What comes to mind when I say Nintendo? Now, I imagine for most people, they think of Mario or The Legend of Zelda, but for quite a few others, that honour would also go to Metroid. Despite the franchise never saying nearly as well as its 1980s associates, or even compared to its younger siblings, Metroid is still one of Nintendo's most recognisable IPs, even during periods of droughts with few, if any, mainline installments. While Samus's various appearances in Super Smash Bros., or Nintendo's uncommon willingness to support her back catalogue on current-gen hardware presumably play an integral part in this, I think another major attribute is down to how critically acclaimed many of its titles are, which in turn has mustered a very devout and auditorially outspoken fanbase. Merriam-Webster recognises it as a word, so fuck Oxford Dictionary, which is all the more reason why it's so embarrassing to admit that I have never played a Metroid game. The series has evaded me for the longest time, even with the knowledge of how highly regarded it is. As of today, that changes however, as I trek through the original Metroid released on the NES in 1986, through playing it on the Nintendo Switch Online NES application, and evaluate how well it cultivated the ideas the rest of the franchise would later iterate upon. Visually, Metroid certainly isn't a looker. While the hardware limitations have posthumously given the NES a reputation for producing dated, albeit charming graphics, there are examples on the system that show it is capable of outputting visually appealing games. Developers had to get creative with how they used the low storage capacity, on-screen sprite count, and color palettes in order to create an engaging presentation, through having exaggerated cartoony designs that prioritize expression or more realistic proportions at the expense of less overall detail. While not conforming to either of these binary design approaches isn't inherently flawed, Metroid feels like a weird hodgepodge of the two without the benefits of either. Samus's proportions are weird, with a large head being contrasted by thin, lanky limbs, not helped by a strange walk cycle that feels like three individual poses strung together to make a 4-frame loop, rather than having any dynamic flow. Unlike her contemporaries, she also lacks any distinguishing outline, although that would be negligible in this case, as safe from black voids, the game has no backgrounds to begin with. While it arguably fits the setting, British? It doesn't justify to me what would have been a great means to distinguish locations, especially when room layouts and tiles are so often reused down to having the same hidden spots, although they don't lead to any secrets when copied. Conversely, the color palettes, while very loud and garish, admittedly do a good job at making planet Zebus feel like an extraterrestrial world through painting its natural landscapes in unearthly colours like crimson reds, deep blues, or Piseo. The ecosystem also assists in this, with each area having its own cavalcade of unique enemies, even if they don't always feel representative of their illustrative designs, like Mr. Flying Pistachio over here, or the bosses, who look quite underwhelming. I understand it's due to the aforementioned sprite limitations, but they are nonetheless a far cry from their monumental iterations in Dreg, or even their designs in the manual. This abundance of enemies also has the adverse effect of causing slowdown, with the game chugging as soon as there's too many on screen, which, ironically, seems antithetical to the developer's desires to fill every room to the brim with them, which really shouldn't have taken precedence over technical performance. Overall, while Metroid doesn't look terrible for the standards of an NES game, it isn't particularly noteworthy either, which when mixed with the lackluster performance, leads to a visually mediocre experience. Sound-wise, Metroid fares much better. From the ominous to motivational melody of the title screen, the recognisable slow tempo of the secret room, or the low-pitched build-up and chaotic chorus bridge of Craig's Lair, lending it a necessary feeling of impellment. There's a reason why Hirokazu Tanaka's compositions are still so iconic, and rearranged so often in games like Dread. Take a listen. If I could give any criticism, the sound font mixed with a similar progression leads to some of the tracks sounding quite similar. However, that could just be down to the NES's sound chip only being able to produce a very limited range of synthesizations. While there are debatably better versions of these tracks nowadays, it's still highly admirable what was accomplished here on such restraining sound hardware. Moving on to talking about the gameplay, Metroid is a mixed bag. As an explorative, action-adventure side-scroller, Metroid is one of the main catalysts behind the neologism term of Metroidvania. I mean, when your name is half the portmanteau, I think that much is obvious. It has far more emphasis put into exploration, distancing itself from linear, level-by-level progression, by having you venture through one big labyrinthine world, split into major sections, locked behind power-up tied progression. Although, under this lens, it is relatively quite tenuous, with routing options being rather ill-defined, down to a mix of intentional design decisions on the part of the devs, and antiquated oversights caused by a still blooming understanding of game design. While this may sound good on paper, exciting even, as it allows for varied playthroughs with substantial replay value, in practice, this approach is archaic in execution. The introduction is solid, with you basically being left to your own devices, free to explore the majority of Brinstar, unlocking power-ups like the missiles and bombs to progress. Although, it is around this time when the first issue raises its head, the lack of a map. Without a layout of the locations you've visited, it is quite easy to become disorientated among the repeating vertical shafts. While mentally mapping out the very compartmentalized, rectangular rooms isn't too difficult, or you could even grab a pen and paper and draw out your own map, which is admittedly quite satisfying, as I chose to do for Brinstar, it still doesn't excuse the lack of such an integral feature, which could come in handy during moments of constant forward progression. Even if it was due to hardware constraints, which I doubt, they could have still included a detailed map in the manual, instead of whatever this is. It is also around this time that the Achilles heel of the entire game emerges, that only grows worse as it continues. The health system. Whenever you die, you respawn with only 30 health. Whether your max health is 99 or 699, you'll always respawn with 30. The only ways to refill your health are by either finding an energy tank, for which there are only 8 in the entire game, and no, they don't respawn, or you have to grind energy drops from enemies, with most only dropping 5 health points, so you better be prepared to tediously farm health over and over again. Maybe this was some sort of anti-rental measure, or done to extend the length of what would otherwise be a short game, but let's not beat around the bush here. It's mindless padding, used to unnecessarily bloat and prolong the playtime, and makes every other issue of the game, like the consistently annoying enemy placement or potentially confusing traversal, exponentially worse by making the punishment of death so excruciatingly irritating. When the game expects you to perform a very precise and cumbersome task, only to reveal that it could have been entirely skipped by this inconspicuous bombable block, or punishes you for wanting to explore by trapping you in a troll room that's difficult to get out of, not only is it vexatious, but counterintuitive to the explorative core design philosophy of the game, and the genre it helped to propagate. What's worse is that the next corridor over has the exact same setup as the troll room, with this enemy tipping you off about the floor being bombable, but this time actually rewards you with an early unlock for the ice beam, which is usually found in Norfair. It turns what would have otherwise been a logically gratifying moment into a sour one. Too bad if you chose the wrong corridor, I guess you got the short end of the stick. The screw attack does alleviate this problem to an extent, as it kills enemies instantaneously, which, based on empirical conjecture, seems to drop more fruitful health pickups. However, it's like putting a band-aid on a bullet wound. Sure, it does make the remaining sections of the game far more painless, but it doesn't fix what is an absurd, unfair system, especially since most first-time players aren't going to unlock it until close to the end of the game. I didn't acquire it until already being beating Kraden Ridley, so it only really assisted me with cleanup duty in Ridley's layer and the rest of Norfair, which was right before I went to Torian, the penultimate build up to the final boss. The same criticisms could apply to the high jump as well. Allowing Samus to jump far higher is undoubtedly useful, but it seems to be there to fix the annoying jumping and overly precise base physics. It feels like you have to hold just a little too long to reach maximum height, which is especially noticeable when trying to jump out of lava or acid, and while making small jumps is fine enough, wider ones have Samus automatically going into ball form, which carries a lot of weight and momentum with very loose mid-air turning controls. I appreciate that the game does allow you to change trajectory while airborne, as opposed to fully committing you to each jump, but it still doesn't feel that great to control, and makes precise platforming far more arduous than it needed to be. On the exact opposite side of the scale, with an item that feels entirely superfluous, we have the Wave Beam. Most players by this point would have already gotten the Ice Beam in Brinstar or Norfair, which has the caveat of being weaker, but the massive benefit of freezing enemies. I don't even have that much to say about the Wave Beam, as I accidentally got it during my cleanup of Norfair, and then instantly went back to get the Ice Beam. It may have very particular contextual uses, but at least based on how I routed the game for my first playthrough, by the time I got to it, it was completely redundant. If they gave you an option to switch between the beams, or if their ability stacked, that would have made it actually desirable. But when you have to choose between the two, the Ice Beam almost always wins out, especially when it's required for beating the Metroids in Torian. It just seems like another case of the developers not fully considering how the open form game design may alter player decisions. Wrapping around to talk about the bosses, they are all pushovers. As long as you grind on health and missiles beforehand, you can take them out with little to no tribulation. None of them actually pose a challenge through dynamic attack patterns or difficult movesets to counter. They all just rely on repeating the same basic attack verbatim that you either don't need to avoid or that's fairly easy to dodge. While Mother Brain is probably the most difficult, that is mainly due to the prelude section leading up to it draining a lot of health, since you can get hit during the door animation, which is just great. Once you realise that killing the Metroids gives you ample health and missiles though, all you have to do is barbarically hit your head against the wall until you win. Since the game remembers what glass pillars you shattered, they are lackluster ways to cap off your adventure thus far, to say the least. Overall, for the time, Metroid was a very experimental game, and I do see small shimmers of this gameplay style's benefits. Unlocking new power-ups that recontextualize previous sections is fulfilling, and makes backtracking an exciting prospect rather than a daunting one. Especially with some of the late game abilities, like the screw attack, you get great amounts of utils and serotonin through effortlessly blasting past sections that previously caused you so much trouble. There's definitely the groundwork for a very fun core gameplay loop here. It's just unfortunate that the weaker aspects end up muddying the water. It's a game that is unfortunately worse than the sum of its parts, and for a player wanting to get into the franchise, I would recommend steering clear of this first outing, at least for your first foray into the franchise, unlike what I did. Now, it would be unfair to leave my first impressions of the franchise here. Most fans would probably tell you all the same to avoid starting with this first game, just as I have. And it would be very assumptive to judge 36 years of this franchise based on its first attempt into what was a relatively new and nebulous genre. So join me next time as I look into the newest mainline entry, Metroid Dread, and assess how well it improves upon what worked in this original game, whether it was able to distance itself from those more contentious elements, and look at whatever new features have been added through over 3 decades of deliberation. Thanks for watching, and I hope to see you on the flip side.